Good morning, lovelies. Today is going to be the first of what's probably going to be many videos about world-building governments, and for this video specifically, we're going to talk about something called the tripod of power. That is, three things that every government and ruler needs in order to get and keep their power. For my main source, I'm using this book, Beyond Kings and Princesses by Orwin Litwin. He is both a fantasy author and a political science major, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you get this book because it is fantastic. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also smash the like button. It really helps the channel grow. So what is the tripod of power? Well, there are three sources from which a government gets its power, and they are legitimacy, military, and administrative machinery. When one goes down, the others are pretty quick to follow. We're going to look at each of these legs of the tripod more in depth, what each does, and how it helps the others. And we're going to start with legitimacy. So legitimacy is the reason that this person or this group of people should be in charge of everyone else rather than literally anybody else. It makes acquiring the other two legs of the tripod so much easier. If the leader isn't legitimate, why should anyone give them taxes or follow their laws or fight and possibly die in their military? Transitions of power usually start with transitions of legitimacy. So for example, an old classic in fantasy literature is the rightful heir trope. That is that your main character, the protagonist, is the rightful heir, the person who should be in charge, but the bad guy is their uncle, their half-brother from an illegitimate affair or something like that, and they're the ones who usurped the throne. So the first step is for the rightful heir to prove their legitimacy, their rightful claim to the throne, and that goes a big way into convincing other people to fight for them and get them on the throne. So there are three basic types of legitimacy: charismatic, traditional, and legal or bureaucratic. There's also moral legitimacy, which is a technical fourth, but it rarely bears any weight, especially in politics. Maybe a good person deserves to be in charge, and a lot of people agree that they would be really great at it. But if they lost the election or got legally exiled, they don't have any real legitimacy, which means they don't have power. That sounds cool, but it's true. If they don't have traditional or legal legitimacy, they would have to rely on charismatic, assuming they lived in a society that let that happen. So charismatic legitimacy is leading through sheer force of will and personality. These are self-made leaders, usually starting from scratch. This is typically seen in state or religion founders. For example, I am a Buddhist, a huge religion that has a massive sway mostly in Asia, and that got started by one dude who sat under a tree and then went around telling other people what he thought about. That took a lot of charisma, not only gathering a big enough audience to share his newfound religious beliefs, but also getting them to spread it for him. If your book features a group of people trying to overthrow a current regime, like any dystopian novel ever, whoever's leading the rebels will likely have enough charismatic legitimacy to convince everyone to buck the traditions and laws of the current government. Speaking of traditions, the next step is traditional legitimacy, and it's usually the natural evolution from charismatic. This is what happens after the charismatic leader dies. An heir is typically chosen. This is usually some sort of blood relative or a disciple or anyone with a strong personal connection to the original leader. And this becomes the standard for choosing the new leader. Monarchies are usually really big on tradition because choosing the firstborn son is the way it's always been done. A new leader's legitimacy is dependent on how well they observe the old ways, no matter how illogical or superstitious they are. If they buck tradition too much, they threaten their own claim to rule. This would be a really cool personal conflict if you have someone who really disagrees and wants to change their traditions of their country for whatever reason, but if they go too far, they threaten their own personal power. These traditions often become codified into law and historically have overlapped with religion. This is much more stable than charismatic legitimacy. Depending on the tradition in question, the new leader's skills, personality, and/or moral integrity may be completely irrelevant to whether or not she gets to rule. This tradition of choosing the next ruler can be anything. It could be blood heir, or it could be winning a 3-day battle royale, or they have to pass an exam to ensure that the smartest person possible is in charge, or they could be literally chosen by a physical god or deity. This showcases the values of your fictional culture. Opposing this kind of ruler is risky because you're not just opposing that one person, you are opposing an entire culture's worth of beliefs, traditions, and way of life. Finally, we have legal or bureaucratic legitimacy. And this is when traditions are completely left behind in favor of formal law. This is where a ruler's power is pulled entirely from legal codes and institutional procedures. So for example, a democratic election. Maybe the rulers have traditionally been elected from a certain class, but when there's no law about it, there's nothing stopping someone from a different or perhaps lower class from running for ruler. Almost no government relies purely on one form of legitimacy. They're usually a mix. Monarchies are usually some combination of legal and traditional. Democracies are often a mix of all three. Dictators rely on charismatic and sometimes traditional. It all depends on the culture, the laws in place, and a bunch of other factors. In addition to that, your ruler's chosen type of legitimacy is also going to influence their behavior, because the last thing they want to do is threaten their legitimacy. So, for example, let's say that your leader in your story needs to defeat a political opponent, someone who wants to be the leader instead. A charismatic leader might just simply be able to get them killed, but bureaucratic leaders bound by law need to find a non-violent method of neutralizing them, maybe digging up dirt on their background to blackmail them to silence, or turn other people against them some way. Or if in your story your leader needs an army. Everyone needs an army. Legal and traditional rulers will easily inherit them, but a charismatic leader will need to form relationships, find allies, and convince all these people to fight for them. Losing legitimacy is usually the first step to losing power completely. However, depending on the government structure, it's not necessarily the fatal blow. Legitimacy can be reclaimed or be totally inconsequential if military and administrative legs are strong enough, or if there's a whole legal system that ensures that this person is going to stay in power until this date, at which point anything goes. So ask yourself, what happens when legitimacy is lost or when a rival has a better claim? Who is the first to rebel, why, and how? The second leg of the tripod of power is administration. Nobody rules alone. They have supporters and workers to keep them in power and help them make things run smoothly. The amount of bureaucrats a ruler needs, as well as their specific roles, powers, and levels of discretion, depends largely on the size of the government and country or space being ruled. Smaller countries usually only need a few bureaucrats. Evil empires need whole armies of pencil pushers. The administration has three key roles. They transmit information to the ruler, they execute the ruler's commands and laws, and they collect taxes. Information is incredibly important. A ruler needs reliable information on the status of his country, people, and other countries in order to write effective laws and give good orders. But the ruler doesn't have time to do the hours of research needed to make those calls. And many rulers, especially monarchs, are isolated from their subjects. So even if they did have the time, they don't really have easy access to those subjects. So bureaucrats are used to collect, sift through, and present the required information for the ruler to make informed decisions. And as you've probably guessed, trust is crucial for this to work. If a bureaucrat misrepresents, hides, or outright fakes certain information that the leader then acts on, it can have devastating consequences. It's like the world's worst game of telephone. Gatekeepers are common in history and literature. This is usually some sort of high-ranking minister or royal consort who gets all of the real information, and then they give a filtered version to the actual ruler, such as the king, depending on what they want him to know. This is the person who has the ear of the king and are the real power behind the throne. For a really great fictional example, this would be Long Feng in the Avatar: The Last Airbender series. He has access to all of the information to the point that the Earth King doesn't even know that there's a war going on. That is gatekeeping to the extreme. This is why loyalty is often considered more valuable to rulers than competence. However, there are other ways to handle this. Sneaky rulers will set up shadow institutions staffed by people who've truly proven their loyalty to check the work of the other officials, or they'll purposefully plant fake information to see who picks up on it and tries to sell it to them as real information. As you can imagine, there are a ton of possibilities here, especially if your story is pretty heavy on the political intrigue. The second task of the administration is executing the laws. There's no point in making laws if you don't have anyone to enforce them. Bureaucrats carry out the will of the ruler, whatever that may be, but they have their limits. Today, state and national bureaucrats are seen every day by regular people, but that's a relatively new thing. Throughout most of human history, the reach of bureaucrats have been limited by resources and technology. They can't be everywhere at once. They don't have airplanes to go wherever they want. They don't have computers to cyber spy on anyone they want. They just didn't have that. So instead, they relied heavily on local authorities. Petty nobles and gentry, local priests and bishops, tribal leaders, anyone who has sway at the lower level, they rely on them to carry out the will of the ruler. In the Wild West, mayors, state senators, and other local leaders had way more power than their eastern counterparts because they were so far from the federal government. That changed as transportation and the ability to send information got easier and faster. This is also true of empires. The emperor doesn't give direct orders to all of his subjects. If he changes a law, he'll tell the kingdom and colonies he rules and rely on those rulers to make sure the people in their charge obey. The larger the state, the more bureaucrats are needed and the more heavily they rely on local leaders. Balancing the will of the top ruler and that of the locals is a very delicate art. Failure usually results in the ruler losing those locals to a more charismatic leader. And of course, taxation. That and death are the only certainties in life. Governments need money to pay armies, bureaucrats, infrastructure, and 100 other things, and taxes are one of the best ways to get it. The only real question is, who's going to get taxed, how much, and in what way? Also, where is that money going? Is the ruler using it responsibly, or is he squandering it? People don't like their money being used to pay for nice clothes or palaces that they're never going to use, instead of, say, beefing up the military during a war or feeding hungry citizens. One of the biggest problems is that nobody wants to pay taxes because we like money, so rulers have to find other ways to convince them. Harsh laws and military force are favorites of dystopias and evil empires, but they aren't necessary. In fact, you can convince people that paying taxes is a good thing. In ancient Athens, for instance, only the wealthiest citizens paid income taxes, and it was considered a great honor to be able to support the state. They created a whole culture where people wanted to pay taxes because it meant you were not only rich enough to do so, but it also made you a model citizen that everyone looked up to. Propaganda at its finest, people. The final leg of the tripod of power is the military. Because legitimacy and administration are great, but if you don't have the muscle to back you up, what's stopping people from saying no? But more importantly than controlling military, rulers need to control violence. The when, where, and how it happens. Because having a military that just indiscriminately beats up whoever pisses them off is no good to anybody. The government controls the military, but it must be careful not to let the military control the government. if the military becomes too powerful, it can become a real threat to the ruler. So for example, in Japan, there used to be two guys, the emperor and the shogun. The emperor was theoretically the top dog, but the shogun was the one who controlled the military. So even though the shogun was subordinate to the emperor on paper, in reality, the emperor was just a figurehead, more often than not. Military technology is also an important thing to consider here. The more accessible weaponry is to common citizens, the more likely they will have a bigger say in government affairs. So for example, the entire army of ancient Athens was made up of their citizens who bought their own armor and weapons and were pretty easy to train. So the right to vote extended only to men able to afford those weapons because they didn't want to piss off their own military. Of course, if you go too far with weapon accessibility, you end up with something like child soldiers in endless civil wars. Bad for governments, great for storytelling. If, on the other hand, advanced weaponry is contained to the few, chances are that few are the ones in charge and have fewer restrictions on how to use that power, like the knights and feudal lords of Europe. Con, this can turn into a nasty authoritarian dystopia. Pro, the ruler also probably has the wealth to invest in something like, say, cannons. More than keeping control of the citizens, large militaries are also for protection from outside forces. You don't want to get invaded and lose power to foreigners. Not only that, but people go where they feel safest, and that includes the country with the best army. The more powerful and secure the military, the more likely you'll end up with immigrants and refugees from less stable areas seeking safety. With sci-fi and fantasy elements, the main questions to ask here is how widespread and destructive is magic and sci-fi weapons? How easy are they to use? Do you need years of training or just a few hours? Who has access to it? This will help determine how strong the military leg of the tripod is and who controls it. I could go all day on just the subject of militaries, and I will when I do a video about it, but for now, I've already been talking forever, so let's wrap this up. That is the tripod of power. 3 things every government, fictional or otherwise, needs in order to get and keep power. Hopefully this has helped with your world building, help you figure out how your government works, and what tensions you can use to create a better story. I will definitely be revisiting this topic in future videos, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss them. And if you got any value from this video, hit the like button too. Also, if you need more help with your world building, I already have a dedicated playlist to it. It's going to flash up on the end screen here in just a few seconds. Bye, lovelies!